And after that, bishop to f3 by Carlsen, threatening to push d6 so that he can target this rook. And black can easily defend this by bishop to b7, but here black goes for knight to e5. A good move centralizing the knight as well as targeting this bishop. So that's why bishop to e2. And now for black, it's better to go back to d7 square, but instead he goes for knight to g6, and that's a slight inaccuracy because now you can see white can start pushing this h-pawn, trying to gain space on the king side. But instead, Carlsen decides to just develop his knight to f3, which is also fine, and finally knight takes d5. Okay guys, so now from this position, how will you continue as white? And guys, in this position, white can continue with this amazing sacrifice, knight takes b5. And now I think most of you get the idea that if black captured this knight, simply bishop takes b5 check. And clearly you can see there is only one square left which is already covered by this bishop. So the only move is queen to d7, bishop takes d7, king takes d7, and yup, game over. But after knight takes d5, here Carlsen missed that move and he decides to just castle. And after that, a5, preparing for queen to a4 check. So that's why. And as you can see, Carlsen exchanges the queen because you know he wants to get into the endgame in which he is the goat. Okay, so now bishop to e3, developing this dark square bishop as well as preparing for rook to c1 in future, so that he can take control over this c file. So to stop this, here black goes for rook at h goes to c8, but however rook at f goes to c1, and now for black it's better to just exchange the rooks and then start pushing these pawns, but instead he made an inaccuracy by bishop to f6, which is an unnecessary move because here black is blocking his own pawns. And now it's better for white to just exchange the rooks, because if rook takes c8, then white will capture this pawn on a6. So at the end black is forced to recapture with the king, and by this you can see this position will be better for white. But Carlsen also missed that variation, and instead he decides to bring his knight back to e1, preparing for knight to d3 and then knight to c5. And since white can now anytime go for knight to d3, which will target this pawn, so that's why here black decides to just push this pawn further to b3. Which is of no use, because however Carlsen goes for knight to d3, and he is now creating the same threat of knight to c5 check. So to stop this, here black brings his bishop back to e7, covering this c5 square so that this knight can't enter. Okay, so now knight to d8, preparing for e5 so that he can target this rook. But guys, instead of this, king to d6 might be the better option for black, bringing this king into the endgame. And if white tries to give a check from f4 square, black can easily tackle this by pushing e5, and obviously white cannot capture this e5 pawn because of this d4 pawn is already guarding this rook. So that's why, to avoid all of this, here Carlsen goes for bishop to f4, a good move covering this d6 square so that this king can't go further, and white is also threatening to go for bishop to b8 check, and if rook to a8, then white will give a check from c7 square by rook to c7 check. So that's why the only move is rook to a8, rook to b7, and after that white can bring his bishop back to g3 and continue by king to e3, and by this you can see this is completely winning for white. So that's why, to stop all of these complications, here black brings his knight to c6, covering this b8 square so that this bishop can't enter, and now black is threatening to capture this d4 pawn. So that's why. And now for white, it's better to just capture on g6, because after h takes g6, king to f4, rook to a8, king to g5. You can see white is getting closer to these pawns. And if let's suppose knight to d5, bishop to c4, attacking this pawn, as well as this knight, which cannot be defended by black rook due to the presence of this bishop, which is eyeing on this b8 square, which is the only hope for saving this b3 pawn. And by this you can see white is winning. But after bishop to c6, here Carlsen missed that move, and he made a mistake by bishop to c4. Yes, he is targeting this b3 pawn, but he forgets that black can now capture on h5 by g takes h5. This is because after g takes h5, now comes this beautiful move f6, trying to deflect this bishop, because if bishop takes f6, knight to d5 check, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and suddenly you can see white loses all of his advantage, and now this game is completely equal. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to c4, yeah, after this move here, black also missed that move, or we can say this amazing opportunity to saving this game, and instead he goes for bishop to d5. And again, white can capture this pawn on g6, but Carlsen decides to push this pawn further to h6. And now f6 might be the better option for black, so that he can target this bishop supported by this knight, but he missed that, and instead he go back to e7 square, so that he can target this undefended f3 pawn, which is an inaccuracy, because you can see white can easily tackle this by pushing his f pawn further, and also with the move king to e2. And yes, black can now go for knight to d5, but here he decides to go for and bishop goes to f6. But guys, instead bringing this king further to e3 might be the better option for white. Okay guys, now bringing this king further to f4 might be the better option, but instead Carlsen decides to exchange the rooks. Which is bad, because as you know, because as we previously saw that this rook was creating extra pressure on the black king, but after exchanging the rooks, now you can see this king can move freely. Bishop to e7, targeting this knight, which is not required, because black can easily bring his knight back to c6. Instead, giving a check from e5 square might be the better option for white. And now for black, it's better to just push this pawn to f6. Yeah, trying to break this pawn structure of white, but instead he made a mistake by pushing e5. And here's note one thing, that white cannot capture this pawn on e5 because this is a trap. This is a trap by black, because let's suppose if king to e6, and if you try to defend this pawn by, let's suppose, going to this, let's suppose e4 square. Now comes bishop to b7 check, king to f4, king to d5, and you can see black is getting closer to the pawn, and if this king goes backward, then black will capture this central e5 pawn of white, and by this you can see this game is now completely equal for both. So that's why after calculating all of this, after the move e5, here Carlsen finds the best move d5, a good move, completely closing the fire line of this light square bishop. And if king to d6, then simply king to e4. So that's why And in this position, Petros resigned, because clearly you can see this game is completely winning for white. Let's suppose if this game continues like f6, simply g takes f6, bishop to e6, d7 check, trying to deflect, but simply king takes d7, king takes h7, bishop to f7, and finally king to g7. And clearly you can see now no one can stop this pawn from promotion. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.